In the late 15th century, we saw this lady come to prominence. She was a major figure in the War of the Roses and the mother of the first Tudor monarch. She was influential in bringing the country together and orchestrating a new power in the kingdom. From a precarious childhood to a political powerhouse, join me now as we look at the life of Margaret Beaufort.
Margaret was the daughter of John Beaufort, the Duke of Somerset. Her mother was Margaret Beauchamp of Bletsoe. Margaret was born at Bletsoe Castle in Bedfordshire on the 31st of May 1443. However, the year of birth is disputed. Her father had been preparing to visit France. It was to lead a military expedition on behalf of King Henry VI. Somerset had talks with the king saying if he should be killed whilst away, what authority would be placed on his daughter. Somerset was a tenant-in-chief to the crown, and this created a wardship, which meant that his heir would be placed under the crown in a feudal system. The system was part of a society that organised political and military leadership and forced a formal structure based on land tenure. However, Somerset returned from France, but he somehow managed to have a falling out with the king. This didn't go down well, and he found himself banished from the court, but now also on a charge of treason. It wouldn't be long after the altercation that Somerset died. The evidence suggested he had become ill, although the Crowland Chronicle described his death as suicide.
For Margaret, this would be a trying time, as she had not only secured a small fortune as the only surviving heir, but she now also had a claim to the throne. When Margaret reached her first birthday, the king decided to break the arrangement he had with her father, meaning all her lands and wardship would now be given to William de la Pole, the first Duke of Suffolk. Margaret's mother was again pregnant, but unfortunately she lost the child. This would still make Margaret the sole heir. She was the only legitimate child of her father. However, she did have half-brothers and sisters from her mother's first marriage.
At the age of three, Margaret was married to John de la Pole, the son of William, 1st Duke of Suffolk. It didn't go well for Suffolk Senior. He was arrested on the charge of creating a secure future for his son by betrothing them to a wealthy ward, and one that had a potential claim to the throne. But remarkably, it all ended with a papal dispensation for the marriage in 1450.
Later in life, Margaret never accepted this marriage and gave it no recognition. She was now looking for her next husband, and her marriage to John de la Pole was dissolved. King Henry stepped into the fray and placed his arm around Margaret by granting wardship to his half-brothers Jasper and Edmund Tudor. Her first marriage wasn't recognised under canon law due to her being under the age of 12 at the time, so Henry VI now chose Margaret to become a bride for his half-brother Edmund Tudor, the 1st Earl of Richmond, a decision made to ensure an heir was in place if Henry became forced to give up his reign, as the king had no legitimate children of his own. At the ripe old age of 12, Margaret was now to be married. This time there would be no repercussions, and on the 1st of November 1455 to Edmund, who was 12 years her senior, Margaret claimed Edmund divinely guided her to do so.
Throughout England, it was a time of civil disruption. The Wars of the Roses had broken out. For Edmund, the timing couldn't be worse. As a Lancastrian, he was captured and taken prisoner by the Yorkist forces. Within a year, he died of the plague while still in prison at Carmarthen on the 3rd of November 1456. It left Margaret, now 13, a widow, but she was also carrying his child and 7 months pregnant. It would be Margaret's only child and something that would resonate with her throughout her life. In her will, she had specified that she wanted to be buried next to Edmund. Although her third husband and herself enjoyed an extraordinarily long and stable marriage, yet Margaret's roots remained with her beloved Edmund.
Jasper Tudor took Margaret into care, and on the 28th of January 1457 she gave birth to a healthy son, Henry Tudor. The delivery was complicated mainly due to her age at the time of just 13 and the fact that she had not physically matured enough. Her confessor John Fisher said it was a miracle that she even got through this. But she wouldn't be single for long. It was important to get security in place for her son, and at the age of 14 and now betrothed to Sir Henry Stafford, the son of Humphrey Stafford, the 1st Duke of Buckingham, they were joined in wedlock on the 3rd of January 1458. Although the two were cousins, a special dispensation allowed the marriage to occur. The couple lived at Woking Palace and were given 400 marks worth of land from Buckingham, However, she still had sufficient funds from her own estates to support their new lifestyle. As for her son Henry, he was kept under the care of Jasper at Pembroke Castle in Wales.
The Wars of the Roses continued. Yorkists and Lancastrians were constantly at each other's throats, culminating in the Battle of Towton in 1461. Yorkists overwhelmed their opponents and victory placed Edward IV now as the new King of England. For Margaret, the battle was hard and a sad end as she lost her father-in-law, and it forced Jasper Tudor to flee the scene, first to Scotland, then over to France to try and gain support on behalf of his faction.
Edward, the new ruler, took away Margaret's lands and gave them to his brother, the Duke of Clarence. By 1469, Clarence had become tired of his brother's reign, and with the Earl of Warwick, he incited a rebellion against Edward. Although Edward was captured, it wouldn't be long before he regained power. There was a brief lull where Margaret tried to communicate with Clarence and possibly gain back her lands and son. However, in 1471, swords were drawn again, this time at the Battle of Barnet. The Yorkists won and Edward was back in charge. It was now that Margaret begged Jasper to flee once again, but this time take her now 13-year-old son Henry with him. It would be another 14 years before Margaret saw her son again.
The battle not only decided the country's future monarchy, but also made Margaret once again a widow. Her husband had been killed in action. In the June of 1472, Margaret remarried, this time to Thomas Stanley, the Lord High Constable and King of Man. It wasn't something she dwelled on. Some say the marriage was of convenience, but this did allow Margaret to return to Edward's court and possibly a route to access for her son to one day become king. It seems all her efforts proved fruitful as the Queen, Elizabeth Woodville, chose Margaret to become a godmother to one of her daughters.
After Edward died, the throne was seized by Richard of Gloucester. For Margaret, this was an opportunity to return to court to serve the new Queen, Anne Neville. Margaret had carried Anne's train at her coronation, and quite possibly after having a word with Richard, it seems she successfully negotiated a return for her son. Yet despite these secret talks, it is known Margaret had conspired with Elizabeth Woodville. The latter was the mother of the two princes confined in the Tower of London by Richard. After rumours circulated about their deaths, Margaret began to worry about her own son's fortune.
The secret correspondence between Margaret and Elizabeth continued to drive out Richard, with the aim to replace him with Margaret's son, Henry Tudor. With the plan coming together, they agreed to betroth Henry to Elizabeth of York. By doing so, it would attract both Lancastrian and Yorkist followers to come together. With regards to the princes, it always been suspected that Richard was the man who gave the order to have them killed. But another suggestion was that the event seemed to have quickened Henry's rise to the throne. Quite possibly this gave Margaret enough motive herself to recommend the order be carried out. The narrative aside, Margaret's contemporaries offered more enlightening words about her, claiming she would not contrive such affairs. As a pious woman, she should be removed from accusations of wickedness. Erasmus, who spoke with John Fisher, only had praise for Margaret and her support of religious institutions. This charitable act allayed any further criticism of her, at least for the time being.
In 1483, Buckingham raised a rebellion. This time Margaret was involved, her motive to dethrone Richard and get her son Henry into power. Yet Henry was in Brittany, and although he set out for England, his arrival was late. In October, Buckingham had failed and was executed. As for Henry, he left once again across the Channel with his tail between his legs. Luckily for Margaret, she survived Richard's wrath, although she was attainted, which arose from being condemned for a serious capital crime. Usually, this entailed losing your life and property and hereditary titles, and typically the right to pass them on to your heirs. Richard certainly could have gone further in his vitriol, but the outcome was to be self-isolated at her home without any further correspondence with her son. This was quite a mild setback. Margaret, if anything, was cunning and ingenious. She would continue to keep in touch with Henry, and now Henry knew himself, his mother would leverage support to bring him back to England.
Margaret's husband kept a low profile. He did fight for Richard during the Buckingham Rebellion, but gave no response to action at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485. With victory secured, Margaret was well over the moon. The delight was there for everyone to see. Richard was dead, and now Henry Tudor, the son she had fought for over many years, had the crown placed upon his head. A new time was in the offing for England, a new house and a new regime, as the Tudors were now in control.
With the Battle of Bosworth now a distant memory, Margaret could settle down to a new life at court as a countess, but also referred to as My Lady, the King's mother. Her efforts in securing her son's reign were rewarded. She had the attainder placed upon her by Richard removed, and Margaret was now at a very high stature, and she gained much independence and social standing. As previously arranged before the new regime, Henry now married Elizabeth of York. Margaret was, well, reluctant to say the least about gaining a lower status than her new queen consort. So to appease her mood, Margaret wore the same quality of clothing and was always just a pace behind her.
Margaret now had much influence within the Tudor court. It would be a Spanish envoy, Pedro de Ayala, who noticed and commented on her in 1498. He stated that Henry had been influenced so much by his mother and that his followers also showed a great dedication to agree. Although her position at court was undeniably at the king's request, her son Henry quite possibly needed to pursue a more relaxed area for his mother to operate. And although Margaret maybe regretted ever becoming queen herself, her passion for achieving and activating new political rights would undoubtedly continue.
Two legal acts were put in place, the first to void and annul the enforcement of taking land and property, as had happened to her with Richard. The second was pursuing any legal challenge with regards to property or title, as a single unmarried person may do, even if still married. In 1485 the two acts were passed. Both, of course, would be beneficial to herself and her son. It also guaranteed that Margaret could use any wealth granted to her for her purposes, which would stem any reasonable covert attempts by others to consider this as an option against her. It would be Polydore Virgil, the chronicler at the time, by stating the mother and son partnership involved a share of Henry's private and public resources, which he freely gave to his mother. This act contravened any thoughts that Margaret may desire any further powers, and in a letter to his mother, Henry wrote,
"Not only in this but in all other things that I may know should be to your honour and pleasure, and will of yourself, I shall be as glad to please you as your heart can desire."
Margaret's unique position allowed her to operate beyond the duty of a queen. She was in a very privileged position and one that would neither hinder nor irritate others at court. Instead, her loyalty to others who she could trust were brought into affairs, strengthening her son's position and the Tudor dynasty. In 1499, Lady Margaret took a vow of chastity, which was given with her husband's permission. It was a highly unusual declaration, although not an unprecedented one at the time. Once agreed, she moved away and lived alone at Collie Weston in Northamptonshire.
She was now actively living the domestic life of a royal. In this time she created new protocols surrounding birth and upbringing. However, her relationship with her daughter-in-law had been described as a little hostile, but both worked together to plan future marriages of royal children, especially the one of Catherine of Aragon to Elizabeth's son, Prince Arthur. When Elizabeth died in 1503, Margaret stepped up again and now became the principal female at court. Upon the death of Prince Arthur, it was Margaret that forced the new heir apparent, the young Henry VIII, into ensuring his upbringing was fit for a king. Margaret was always renowned for her dynamic actions and educational theories, yet everything in her life revolved around the well-being of her son, a love that was deep, but also a resolve that committed her to an undying loyalty. One of Henry's letters to his mother survived, and in it he wrote of his gratitude and appreciation.
"All which things according to your desire and pleasure I have with all my heart and goodwill given and granted unto you. I shall be as glad to please you as your heart can desire it, and I know well that I am as much bound so to do as any creature living, for the great and singular motherly love and affection that it has pleased you at all times to be towards me."
Henry VII died on the 21st of April 1509. He had designated his mother to take charge of his will. For now, Margaret looked upon a swift and smooth succession to the crown, but this would take 2 days before finally her grandson Henry VIII was proclaimed king. At her son's funeral, she was given precedence over all other women of the royal family. Margaret now once again offered help, this time to Henry, the new Tudor king. Henry, who was only 18, required to choose new members of his Privy Council. Still, it was Margaret's suggestions that he took to hold the roles.
The day after her grandson Henry's 18th birthday, The Countess died on the 29th of June 1509. This was also just 2 months after her son had passed away. Her burial took place in the Henry VII Chapel of Westminster Abbey. Her tomb depicts Margaret with her head resting on pillows and her hands raised in prayer. The black marble tomb is a lasting memorial to the lady who endured much throughout her life.
What a life this lady had. From birth she was thrust into marriage, the first of 4 throughout her life. By the age of 13 she was pregnant and gave birth to her one and only son. But she would never forget her roots, especially her beloved Edmund. Margaret was powerful. She gained much exposure throughout the Wars of the Roses and was extremely active in securing her son as the new king. And her powers of persuasion were strong. She managed to gain help from numerous people of the time to switch loyalties and help create what she thought would be a lasting dynasty. Henry Tudor claimed the throne of England with his mother by his side. He was his staunchest supporter, and without her aid, who knows what might have happened over the coming years. Margaret was a hero. She overcame misery and pain, her singular aim in life to create a new kingdom, one in which her son would rule over. Margaret was always under scrutiny, accused of plotting the Princess in the Tower's death, yet she was a wily character and always had answers to the most difficult of questions. Yet she achieved so much. Margaret was a lifelong artistic patron and a big fan of education. She was practical and astute. Lady Margaret Beaufort and her story throughout medieval times is another story you really couldn't make up. She would spend the best part of 6 decades building upon her successes until her goal was finally achieved. She was an influential figure of the day and best summed up as her motto suggests above the Lady Margaret Hall in Oxford. Think of me often. And we will, for Margaret was undoubtedly the matriarch of the Tudors. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. For more amazing stories, join me today and benefit by subscribing. Oh, and check out both the videos coming up on the screen right now. And I'll see you again soon, here on the History Roadshow.